Karoline Leavitt was no stranger to the oppressive weight of a courtroom, nor the intricate dance of legal combat. For years, she had navigated the treacherous trenches of the nation's most high-profile and complex cases, her reputation preceding her like a whispered legend among legal circles. She was known not just for her sharp mind and meticulous preparation, but for an unyielding tenacity that saw her through battles lesser attorneys would have abandoned. Her victories were etched in the annals of legal history, testaments to her ability to expose truth, no matter how deeply buried. But today, as she prepared to step into the domain of Judge Howard Gates, the air felt different, thicker, charged with an almost palpable dread. Judge Gates, the name itself sent a shiver through the legal community. A man notorious for his razor-sharp tongue, his autocratic rulings, and a contempt for anything that dared to challenge his perceived omnipotence. His courtroom was less a chamber of justice and more a theater where he, the sole arbiter, delighted in dismantling careers and crushing spirits with a flick of his wrist. Karoline had faced formidable opponents, but Gates was not merely an opponent, he was an institution, a colossus bestriding the legal landscape with unchecked power. Today wasn't just another hearing, it was a powder keg waiting for the slightest spark to ignite, and Karoline could feel the volatile weight of what was to come. The case at hand was an absolute behemoth, a high-stakes government ethics violation that had already sent tremors through the state. Its potential fallout was staggering, threatening to topple established careers, unravel intricate political alliances, and send shockwaves through the very foundation of public trust. The defendant, a wealthy developer whose connections ran deeper than the roots of ancient trees, stood accused of brazenly funneling state funds into his sprawling private ventures. The evidence Karoline had amassed was damning, a meticulously constructed edifice of financial records, intercepted communications, and sworn testimonies. She had spent weeks, relentless days and nights preparing her arguments, anticipating every conceivable angle of attack. Yet no amount of preparation, no prior experience could have truly prepared her for the sheer, suffocating hostility that awaited her in Judge Gates' courtroom. As she approached the plaintiff's table, the air grew thick with a tension that was less about the proceedings and more about the man presiding over them. Judge Gates didn't even grant her the courtesy of a glance. Instead, he deliberately, almost ostentatiously, flipped through a file on his bench, his movements slow and calculated, as if to emphasize his utter disdain for her presence, for the case, for the very concept of being challenged. The courtroom sat in suffocating silence, a stillness that wasn't merely procedural, but intentional, designed with chilling precision to intimidate. Finally, without lifting his gaze from the file, Judge Gates broke the silence. "Miss Leavitt," he drawled, his voice a low, grating sound, dripping with an almost theatrical sarcasm. "I assume you've prepared something with substance today, or—" He paused, the silence stretching ominously. "Should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A few muffled chuckles, mostly from the defendant's smug legal team, echoed from the back of the courtroom. Karoline's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching almost imperceptibly, but she didn't flinch. She had faced worse than a condescending judge. What she didn't know yet, what no one in that room could have possibly predicted, was that this was only the beginning. The tables so firmly set by Judge Gates were about to turn in a way that would rewrite the very definition of courtroom justice. She ignored the smirks, her voice calm but firm, as she began. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Judge Gates leaned back in his ornate leather chair, the picture of feigned boredom, his gaze drifting somewhere above Karoline Leavitt's head. "Taxpayer dollars, right?" he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." A few more muffled chuckles rippled from the defense side, their smirks barely concealed, emboldened by their judge's open contempt. Caroline's jaw tightened again, a familiar knot of indignation coiling in her gut, but her tone remained as steady as bedrock. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she countered, her voice resonating with quiet conviction, "I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." For a brief, charged moment, their eyes locked. His were cold, calculating, assessing. Hers unwavering, a mirror reflecting his arrogance back at him. But before she could continue, before she could even draw breath for her next point, he cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Miss Leavitt, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur, a collective sigh of discomfort rippled through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were now leaning forward, their senses heightened, detecting the subtle shift from professional decorum to something far more personal. Judges could be tough, uncompromising even, but this felt different. This felt like a targeted assault, an orchestrated effort to disarm and discredit. Karoline took a slow, deliberate breath, recalibrating her strategy. She understood what Gates was doing. He wanted her off balance, seeking to control the tempo of the proceedings, to force her onto the defensive before she could even begin. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. With a precision born of years in combat, she picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open with deliberate, unhurried movements. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice clear and measured, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate—" "Miss Leavitt, do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" The shift in the room was instant, palpable. The defense attorney's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. A few reporters in the gallery exchanged rapid, knowing glances, their pens poised. But Karoline didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation, on seeing their opponents rattled. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattled, to absorb their blows and return them with quiet, devastating force. She paused just long enough to make her statement without uttering a single word, letting the silence accuse him, then continued, her voice steady and unyielding. She set the folder down, clasped her hands together, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, certainly not disrespectful in its phrasing, but it was pointed, a clear warning. She wasn't going to roll over. The judge's lips curled slightly. Was it amusement? Annoyance? It was hard to tell, a fleeting shadow across his imperious features. But he wasn't done. Not yet. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Leavitt. I just know a weak case when I see one." This time the reaction wasn't just murmurs. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. Someone whispered something under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Karoline could feel the weight of the room shifting, eyes darting between her and Gates like spectators at a tense tennis match. But she wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. That's what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers on her table, and looked him dead in the eye. Then she spoke, her voice steady. "I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as she spoke, she caught something in his expression, something beyond the usual arrogance and condescension. There was a flicker of something deeper, a shadow of an underlying agenda. It was the look of a man who had a stake in the outcome of this case. And that's when she knew. This wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't being combative for sport. He had something to hide. But what he didn't know was, so did she.
Karoline Leavitt had been in plenty of tense hearings before, moments where the air crackled with unspoken threats and the weight of a judge's gavel felt like a physical blow. But this was something else entirely. Judge Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her, to dislodge her composure, to bury the truth in front of the entire courtroom. But why? She could feel the relentless weight of his stare as she moved through her arguments, every word she spoke a target for his next pounce. She could practically see it, the slight curl of his lips, the slow, rhythmic tap of his fingers on the bench, as if he was daring her to keep going, daring her to expose the very thing he was so desperate to conceal. She wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she continued, her tone measured, her voice clear despite the suffocating tension, "these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in the state records." She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the hushed room, but her focus remained razor-sharp on the projection screen, where the damning financial statements were now displayed for all to see. "Now, if you look here, Miss Leavitt," Gates cut in, his voice carrying that same smug, condescending edge, "I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." Karoline glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. His disdain for the evidence was blatant, almost comical in its transparency. "Your Honor, with all due respect," she said, her tone firm, "these numbers are the very foundation of this case." "Right," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair, a picture of insufferable arrogance. "And yet I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this." There it was again, that insidious phrase, wasting time. He was trying to bury this case, to suffocate it before it could even draw its first true breath. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the sound of the prosecution team shifting, exchanging worried looks. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Karoline tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her meticulously organized file. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to—" "Denied," he snapped, his voice sharp, silencing her mid-sentence. She looked up, her eyes narrowing, a flicker of something dangerous in their depths. "I haven't even stated the motion yet," she said, her voice a low challenge. "And yet," Gates said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the bench, his gaze piercing, "I can already tell you it's going nowhere. Let's be honest, Miss Leavitt, this entire case is built on speculation, a little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked, a silent agreement passing between him and the judge. He hadn't had to say a word. Gates was doing all the work for him. Karoline exhaled slowly, her voice steady, but now edged with a cutting precision. "Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before even hearing its contents?" A pause. A beat too long. Then Gates leaned back, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer." The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it was shifting. Eyes darted, heads turned. Even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Karoline caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s wearing a dark blazer. The woman's brows furrowed, her lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one taking notice. The problem with arrogance, Karoline knew, was that it made people pay attention. Karoline squared her shoulders, her voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, her movements deliberate, her resolve unshaken. She clicked to the next slide, her voice steady but carrying a new, chilling edge. "This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that—" "Miss Leavitt?" The tone was different this time. A sharp, almost panicked shift. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. He wasn't just annoyed, he was rattled. Karoline approached the bench. It wasn't a request. She had hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed as she reached the bench. He lowered his voice, just enough so only she could hear. "I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here." She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me?" "I'm saying," he murmured, his tone icy, a barely veiled threat, "that some fights aren't worth having." She let that sit in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned in just an inch closer. "I don't scare easily, Judge Gates." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table, but that moment told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a power move. It was a warning. A veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility, but this was something deeper. Judge Gates wasn't just biased, he was protecting something or someone. Leavitt adjusted a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence." Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Then finally he said, "Proceed, but keep it brief." Karoline didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed cost total is just over $2 million. She paused, then with deliberate precision, placed another sheet on the projector. However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. She placed a third document down, her gaze now locking with Gates. And here is the approval signature, signed off by, she hesitated, letting the full weight of the moment land, letting the revelation hang in the electrified silence. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A ripple of movement, eyes darting, pen scratching furiously. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression wiped clean, replaced by sheer disbelief. Judge Gates didn't move. For the very first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, his face was unreadable. Karoline Leavitt let the silence hang for a moment longer. Then she continued, her voice calm and measured. "Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant?" It was a calculated risk, a daring move. She didn't have the full story yet, but what she did have was enough to shake the very foundation beneath him. Gates finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. "That document," he said slowly, his voice strained, "is inadmissible." "How so?" "It was obtained improperly." He flared his nostrils, a desperate cornered animal. "Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court." This time, the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, everyone was watching, their expressions a mixture of shock and growing suspicion. Karoline crossed her arms, her tone calm but cutting. "Your Honor, do you realize this is a public hearing, that the media is here, that every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason?" A muscle in his jaw jumped. "That's enough, Miss Leavitt." She didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly, deliberately, she sat down. And that's when she did something that changed everything. She reached into her case and pulled out a small recorder, placing it on the table. She pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The recording crackled, then continued. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Karoline didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because now every single person in the room had heard him, and the real game was about to begin.
The recording ended, leaving nothing but thick, suffocating silence in its wake. No murmurs, no whispered speculation, just a stunned, collective realization that hung heavy in the air. Judge Howard Gates had just been caught. Karoline Leavitt didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the small recorder on the table, as if daring him to challenge what had just been revealed. But he didn't. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney finally blinked, his composure slipping like sand through an hourglass. The smug smirk, a constant fixture since the hearing began, was gone, replaced by something closer to dread. He glanced nervously at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The man looked pale, his face a mask of dawning horror. Judge Gates cleared his throat, a dry, strained sound that seemed to catch in his constricted windpipe. "Miss Leavitt, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but that's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor," Karoline interrupted, her voice unwavering, cutting through his feeble attempt at deflection. "The real question is, who are you talking to?" His fingers curled into fists, white-knuckled against the polished wood of the bench. "This is outrageous," he snapped, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding." "Chaos?" Karoline repeated, her tone light,
almost amused, a stark contrast to the coiled tension that filled the room. I'd say this is clarity. Finally, we have some transparency in this courtroom. The tension hitched up another notch, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Karoline let the moment breathe, letting him sweat, letting the gravity of his exposed corruption sink in. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached for another document and slid it across the table. Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap, legally obtained during our investigation. She tapped the top of the page with a single, firm finger. It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording. Judge Gates stared at the page but didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell, his breathing suddenly louder, more pronounced, like a caged animal struggling for air. Karoline turned slightly, looking toward the bailiff, Officer Reynolds. Officer Reynolds, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud? The bailiff hesitated for a fraction of a second, then picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, professional, but the weight of the words made the room feel smaller, the air denser. We'll take care of her. Leavitt doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom. A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery. Karoline folded her hands together. I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor. Judge Gates's eyes flickered toward the side exit, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but enough for the room to realize that for the first time, the man who had seemed utterly untouchable was anything but. He was thinking about something other than his own arrogance now. He was thinking about escape. But it was far too late for that. Motion denied, he barked, his voice sharp, but carrying a faint tremor, betraying the fear beginning to creep into his carefully constructed facade. Karoline raised an eyebrow, a picture of calm defiance. Excuse me? This hearing is over, Gates continued, his voice a fraction too loud, as if volume could mask his desperation. I will not allow— Judge Gates, Karoline said smoothly, cutting him off, her voice laced with an authority that now eclipsed his own. I wasn't asking for your permission. And then she did it. The move she'd been waiting for, the decisive strike. She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest, most supple nod. A door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor, firm and authoritative. And then a voice, clear and resonant, announced, Judge Howard Gates, you are under arrest. Gasps erupted from every corner of the room. Reporters fumbled for their phones, their movements frantic. Cameras clicked, flashes momentarily illuminating the stunned faces. The jury gaped, their impartiality forgotten in the face of such raw, unprecedented drama. Even the defendant, the powerful man who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a formality, looked genuinely stunned, his jaw slack. Judge Gates didn't turn. He didn't even speak. He just sat there, eyes fixed on a single point on his bench, as if he could make everything disappear if he just didn't move. But reality had already caught up with him, a relentless tide that had finally pulled him under.
Karoline Leavitt remained seated as two uniformed officers flanked the judge, their movements precise, authoritative. One reached for his arm, the other pulled out a gleaming set of cuffs. This is absurd, Gates muttered, though the fight had already drained from his voice, replaced by a hollow, desperate whisper. The officer didn't blink, his gaze steady. You have the right to remain silent. But for the very first time in his long, tyrannical career, Judge Howard Gates actually was silent. The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening, echoing through the stunned courtroom. The cuffs locked around Gates's wrists, sealing his fate in front of the very people he had spent years ruling over. The once commanding figure behind the bench now sat frozen, his expression a mask of utter disbelief, a man watching his life crumble in an instant. The courtroom had erupted into stunned murmurs.
disbelief crackling through the air like electricity. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their hands moving furiously across their notepads, desperate to record every detail of history in the making. Even the jury, bound by their solemn duty to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock, their faces etched with the profound impact of what they had just witnessed. Karoline Leavitt stayed seated, her face unreadable. This wasn't about gloating. This wasn't about revenge, not in the petty sense. This was about justice. The judge, Gates, finally found his voice, a raw, almost pleading sound. "You can't do this," he said, his words coming out low, almost a whisper, as if he himself didn't believe them. The officer holding his arm didn't blink. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney." Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing with a mixture of rage and burgeoning panic. "This is a disgrace! I'm the law in this courtroom!" Leavitt finally stood, straightening her blazer with a deliberate, calm motion. "Not anymore." His head snapped toward her, his eyes wide. For the first time, the arrogance that had defined him had been replaced by something else, something closer to raw, unadulterated fear. The officers began to pull him to his feet, but he resisted, a desperate final struggle. "This is political! This is—" Karoline shook her head, her voice resonating with an undeniable truth. "This is accountability." The room went dead silent again, the full weight of her words settling over them. A lifetime of unchecked power, gone in an instant.
Gates's face twisted, his jaw clenching as he turned to the gallery. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally, someone, anyone who would stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved, because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white, his bravado utterly evaporated. The developer, Charles Lawson, the man who had thought his influence could shield him from any consequence, wasn't faring much better. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Karoline let her eyes linger on him for just a second before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and measured, "if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment." Gates's mouth opened, then shut, because there was nothing left to say. The officers began escorting him toward the side exit, a walk of shame witnessed by all. But before they could reach the door, the developer finally found his voice. "Wait! Wait!" His chair scraped against the floor as he shot up, his eyes darting wildly between Gates and Karoline. "This is getting out of hand. We can work something out." Karoline turned, arching an eyebrow, a picture of quiet power. "Work something out?" The man swallowed visibly, unraveling before their eyes. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle," Charles Lawson said, his voice strained, trying desperately to sound reasonable. "Let's be reasonable." Karoline studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Then she took a step forward. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson." His mouth opened, but no words came. She tilted her head, her tone calm but cutting. "Why would that be?" He shook his head, forcing a hollow laugh. "Nervous? No, this isn't sane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you?" Karoline let the question hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on the room. Then she spoke, her voice steady, piercing. "Do you?" Silence. The officers moved again, leading Gates through the door. The moment it shut behind him, the weight of the previous moments settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for too long. And Karoline Leavitt wasn't done yet. She glanced back at the jury, at the judge's empty seat, and then at the defense table, her gaze firm, resolute. "I believe we still have a trial to finish." But after what had just happened, everyone in that room knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of years of entrenched corruption had been lifted in an instant. Judge Gates was gone, hauled out in cuffs, and the shock of it still lingered in the air like the final resonant note of a symphony. Karoline Leavitt took her seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her. The trial wasn't over, not yet, but the biggest obstacle had just been removed. She turned her attention back to the defense table. Charles Lawson, the developer, had gone eerily quiet. His usual smugness had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was still trying to assess how much damage had been done, how much of his safety net had just been ripped away. Karoline could see the wheels turning in his head. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to argue the case on its own merits, and they had none. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but firm. "Mr. Lawson, would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or would you prefer to discuss a plea?" His jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt."
Karoline gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "No, Mr. Lawson, this is justice." He scoffed, shaking his head, a desperate denial. "You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win?" Karoline didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in, letting her answer be understood before it was spoken. "I think it means the system still works," she said finally, her voice clear and strong. "That no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them." Lawson exhaled sharply, a defeated sound. He had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, but it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. The prosecution team exchanged glances, and one of Karoline's colleagues leaned in, a flicker of awe in his eyes. This might be a good time to push for a deal. Karoline considered it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she weighed the options. She could feel the shift in the room, the jury's eyes locked on her, waiting, watching. They had just witnessed something they'd never forget. But she wasn't about to let this end quietly. She stood. "Your Honor," she began, then paused, correcting herself to address the new presiding judge. "Given the events that have unfolded today, I'd like to formally request permission to proceed with additional evidence. It's clear now that a full investigation is necessary to uncover just how far this corruption reaches." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by a gavel tap. Karoline pressed on, her voice unwavering, cutting through the lingering disbelief. "Judge Gates was only part of the problem. If my team was able to uncover this much, it means there's more. More names, more people who believed they were untouchable." She turned sharply to Lawson, her gaze piercing, leaving no room for doubt. "So I'll ask you again, do you want to talk?" Lawson sat rigid, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. He was weighing his options, the stakes clear in the silence that followed. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his collapsing empire, he exhaled. "If I do, I want protection." Karoline nodded slowly, her expression unyielding. "Then you better start talking."
The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The walls that once shielded the powerful had begun to crack, revealing the rot beneath. And Karoline Leavitt had sent a resounding message to everyone watching, to every corner of that compromised system. No one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order and the trial prepared to move forward, reporters in the back of the room scrambled to get their stories out. This wasn't just another case. This was history in the making. And it was only the beginning. The story of Karoline Leavitt teaches us a profound lesson. Justice prevails when courage confronts corruption, no matter how entrenched the power may seem. It's a powerful reminder that systems, though flawed and often tested, can still bend toward truth when individuals refuse to back down. In life, we often face our own Judge Gates figures, obstacles or individuals that intimidate and obstruct our path. Yet, like Leavitt, we can choose to stand firm, armed with persistence and integrity, knowing that the truth inevitably has a way of surfacing. This principle applies everywhere, in workplaces, communities, or even personal battles. It's about holding the powerful accountable and believing that one voice, one determined act can indeed spark monumental change. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope it inspires you as much as it does me. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe for more narratives of courage and truth, and share your thoughts below. What's your takeaway from Karoline Leavitt's epic stand? How do you fight for justice in your own life? Let's keep the conversation going.